Ooh, I'm playing with fire here. All right. So this video is a little bit more serious. I'm going to be talking about the future of the West, the future of Western civilization, and I believe that there are four major blocks in the West, at least nowadays. Obviously, the West is Europe. It started in Europe. It's Greece. It's Italy. It's Christian and traditionally Christian countries. That is definitely the West, and that got into North America, obviously, the U.S., Canada, but also some other colonies of European countries. So Australia, New Zealand, and Latin America overall. They have all, if not most, of what would be considered Western characteristics. So those would be like the four Western blocks of countries nowadays, in my opinion. And like it would be Europe, North America, Latin America, and Australia slash New Zealand. And if you compare them, it's actually a pretty fair comparison because, uh, except for Australia and New Zealand, Latin America, North America, and Europe do have sort of similar populations in terms of like absolute numbers. Obviously, North America has a little bit less. I think Latin America has a little bit more, and Europe is probably the largest one, depending on how many countries you actually consider quote unquote European. But big size, overall Western, fundamentally or at least traditionally Christian, even if it's no longer the case now. Yeah, and literally to the west of everything, except for Australia and New Zealand, because yeah, there's always an exception to the rule. So, what's the future of those countries? What's the future of those blocks? And before I analyze it, I'll probably break it down by block, but I wanted to argue what are, like, or to at least go about what are the main problems with, or not so much problems, but like challenges that the West is having to face right now, and who's more prepared to actually fight them. So, obviously, number one, not number one, but like one of the biggest challenges the West has currently is fertility rates, where virtually every country is under 2.1, and some countries are under 1.5. And if it keeps going this way, then it's not only Western countries that have this problem, right? But it's a lot of Western countries, most Western countries do have this problem somewhat. And the less children people have, the less children those children are going to have. And that is kind of like a snowball effect. And it creates many pressures in social security and in pension systems and in, well, the continuity of human race and all that. So that's obviously relevant. Um, Second problem, which kind of goes in hand because it's kind of a solution to the first problem, but not really, is immigration. And obviously, overall and throughout history, immigration is a net positive. America would not exist if not for immigration. Latin America wouldn't exist if not for immigration. Australia, New Zealand, and fundamentally even Europe. Humans do migrate. They do try to go where they're treated best or where they have more opportunities. And that's always happened. That's always going to happen. But in the West now, there's been a problem where immigration hasn't been followed up by integration, right? And obviously, there's pressures resulted in that, and there's also pressures resulted from illegal immigration, which in many places drives wages down, drives quality of labor down, and this is also a problem that the West has to face. Though I would argue that different places, different regions in the West have dealt very differently with this problem, and some of them are much, even if they do have a lot of immigration, some of them are much better off than others. The third country up right here is just a sort of stagflation in a way. So stagflation, obviously, it's when your economy isn't growing but prices are, and I think one of the best examples of stagflation in the West is probably Italy. The average Italian in 1991 or whenever the euro came up actually made pretty much the same as the average Italian now. So like the net gain in raw numbers in like the average wage of the Italian across 30 fucking years was literally, not figuratively, zero. And then there's inflation. So obviously quality of life slowly degrades to the point where, well, wait a second, in 1990 or 91, Italy was arguably one of the best countries to live on earth. It had experienced extreme economic growth throughout the second half of the 20th century. And, well, especially after the 2008 recession, but even before that, uh, well, it's become more and more fragile. And Italy is just one example. Japan, even though the inflation part of it is fairly small, has also kind of dealt with that problem. Greece, and to a lesser extent, most of the West either has dealt with that problem, is dealing with that problem, or is bound to deal with that problem at some point. And so, yeah, I think those would probably, leaving culture aside, would probably be the biggest challenge in the West. I could talk about culture as well, but I don't want to get too political today. And obviously, some would argue that, not even some would argue, I think everyone agrees that political polarization is delicate and is something that, well, you have to be very careful about. And one thing that's sure that's well obvious is that the West has been increasingly polarized for both sides, and obviously this tension creates a lot of tension, a lot of pressure, and a lot of uh, dissidence in the social fabric. I'm not going to talk as much about this because it gets inevitably political. Like some people would argue, it's because of right wing populism and authoritarianism, and some people would argue it's because of the woke mob and everything related to that. And a reasonable amount of people would say it's both, but I don't want to really get into that. I think with the first three issues, they're a little more of a consensus, I'd say, and easier to tackle. So let's start with fertility. Um, in terms of fertility, I think it's hard to beat Europe. Europe is definitely probably the worst. Southern Europe in particular, if you look at Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, it's not only are they not having children, but the few children they're having, as soon as they become adults, they're leaving. So the average age, the median age in Italy now is 50. And that is crazy. That is absolutely crazy. And the rest of South Europe isn't too far behind. And even North Europe, which kind of has dealt with it a little bit through slightly higher fertility rates and also through immigration from Southern Europe and from other places, is still not in that good of a shape. One exception here, interestingly, is France and to a certain extent the UK. They've had a particularly large immigrant population going back in the last 30, even 50 years. And these immigrant populations of either African or Muslim or both descent, they've kind of maintained a slightly higher fertility ratio or rate, which actually allows for a little bit more of a well, it's a little bit less of a problem in France and the UK. Nah, it's still a problem, don't get me wrong, but it's less. But overall, Europe is definitely like the most problematic in terms of this part of the future of the West. North America could be worse. Latin America, lots of people think Latinos have lots of kids, but if you actually look at fertility rates in, for example, Brazil, which is the biggest Latin American country by quite a big margin, it's literally the same as some Western European countries. It might be lower than France, for example. It's like 1.7, 1.8. And the problem with Latin America, uh, with those fertility rates is Latin America well, it got to this fertility problem before it got rich. So it's getting old before it got rich. And it's one thing for Italy to get old because it was once rich and it kind of lives off the abundance of resources that it actually acquired throughout the 20th century. Whereas, like, for Brazil to grow old, like, it's even more unsustainable because Brazil is still poor. It hasn't actually grown into a rich country, into a rich economy. And if Brazil is an indicator of the rest of Latin America, which I could argue it is, then then we might be going towards a few problems there. So Latin America isn't as healthy in that regard as some people would assume it is. I would put it probably as the second most problematic, second only to Europe. And then, well, North America and Oceania, what the fuck do you say that? And Australia and New Zealand, they're probably equally good, not bad. Like they definitely could be worse. And I think in Australia, in America also, there's still somewhat of a culture of having big families. Like you meet a lot of, not a lot, not a lot, but you meet a bunch of Americans and Australians who still come from fairly large families, like three siblings, four siblings. So it's not as desperate as some other situation would be. So let's leave fertility at that. Let's go to immigration. With immigration, unfortunately, I think Europe probably has the worst situation out of the four as well, because Europe has much more of ethnic based culture in which well, if you're German, if you picture someone who's German in your head right now, you think of a certain type of people and they're certain type ethnically and physically and in appearance, and they have much more of a strict culture, whereas the other three regions, Latin America, Australia, New Zealand, North America, since they were built on immigration to start with, they were built from many more diverse settings and populations, and so their level of integration and the universality of their culture is much, much higher. Uh, and so Europe has had a problem where it's kind of imported people that want to go there because, well, Europe is fairly rich still, but don't want to be European. Like they don't want to be European. And many of them, let's correct that. Some of them do, but the ones who do want to become European, to move to Europe and actually assimilate into the culture, uh, they're not welcome. And they're not welcomed because of this rigid correlation between the countries and ethnicity and language also, which is obviously much bigger problem in Europe because uh, well, English, Spanish, which the other regions mostly speak, they're very global, very universal languages. Also, to be fair, not that complicated if you put it in the grand scheme of things. Whereas, like, if someone tries to learn Czech or German or even French, it might be a little more of a struggle. And again, there's this identity crisis of lack of integration of religion as well with Islam and all that. So Europe is probably in the most dire situation. America, contrary to what most Americans believe, is in a fairly decent situation because besides not having that low of a fertility rate, it's also got immigration from largely Latin American countries, which is another Western bloc. So even though Latinos and Americans are fairly different, their integration is so much easier because, well, they have a Christian background and a European heritage in most cases, and not two different languages, like not languages that are not too far away, too different, and just overall the integration of Latinos in the U.S. Like first generation, well, the first generation to be born in the U.S., they're like already completely American, and it's almost indistinguishable, really. And the US is really remarkable in integrating people. So I would definitely say the US has less problem with immigration than Europe, even if it has more quote unquote illegal immigration, which is still a problem because of well, driving wages down, that kind of thing. Going into Oceania and Australia, New Zealand, I think those are probably the countries that are doing best in terms of immigration because they integrate people pretty well. Maybe not as well as America, but like fairly well. Like people come here and there's a reasonable path to citizenship, and uh, obviously it's a very diverse population. There's a huge Asian population in Australia, in New Zealand. They do integrate pretty well. Sometimes they kind of get locked in into their communities. So I've met Asian descent people like Australians, children of Asian parents who were born in Australia, and they still speak English with somewhat of an accent, which is very weird. And I think it's because they're embodied in a whole Asian community. And if you grow up with that, obviously, even if you're going to school and it's in English, your accent is going to be a little bit different, and you might not be as integrated as other children. But it's a smaller problem than it is in Europe, so to say. And uh, on top of that, there's very little illegal immigration to Australia and New Zealand. They're very strict. It's easier for them because there are islands, and they just do a really good job at vetting people to come here. And if you got skills and if you got something that they need from you, it's stupidly easy for you to come here. Whereas like for the US, with the visa quotas, like the limit on HB1B or HB1, H1B, or green card limits, or all of the funny fuck ups of the American system, which is just cuckoo. Sometimes you get people who are really good not being able to get into the country, and it's much easier for them to come to Australia, to New Zealand, even to Europe, to be fair, because America has a little bit of a cuckoo immigration system nowadays. To be fair, also to give the US some extra points here, uh, the talent-based visas in the US work really well. So what you notice is like if you're like top of the top, be it an artist, actor, musician, scientist, entrepreneur, you just end up in America. Like the amount of companies that move from Europe to America, from Australia to America is stupid. And America still has, in that sense, in this really, really top level immigration, uh, probably the best. It attracts the most people, and it's probably, well, therefore it's probably got the most favorable policy in that sense. And then Latin America, well, Latin America does not suffer from immigration. Quite the contrary, it suffers from emigration, and that is a problem in Latin America as well. Because imagine you're getting old, like Europe gets old, but then it's getting slowed down because it's getting replaced by people who come to Europe, right? Uh, Latin America, it's getting old, but then no one comes here to replace the Latinos who are dying off. And so, and then still they actually, more than that, they go away and they move out. And so I'd say other than Europe, Latin America probably has the second biggest immigration problem, not because of immigration, but because of emigration. And the US, North America in general, and Australia and New Zealand probably have the most solid uh, backgrounds, immigration wise, to get through this problem, let's say, especially Australia, especially New Zealand. I think they're number one in that sense. They're to be looked upon with admiration, and there's a lot the West can learn from them, let's say. And then third, but yeah, kind of last probably because the video is getting kind of long, about stagflation and the economy. And again, Europe really does come dead last year in terms of like it's the most problematic. It's facing this problem a lot. I think maybe Latin America is just as bad as Europe because Europe still has some gems, so to say. Like it's still like a developed, overall developed bloc. Now it's got Switzerland. It's not in the EU, but it's part of the West in Europe, like the European ecosystem. Ireland is doing pretty well. Luxembourg, even the Netherlands has its problems, but it's still like fairly decent. And of course, some of the bureaucracy in the West and in the South is being mitigated by very innovative policy in Poland and Romania, in Hungary to a lesser extent. So I wouldn't say Europe is as bad as it could get, but it's not great, and it shows. Like, uh, if you compare Europe to America in 2007 and now, like the average European has gotten so much poorer compared to the average American that it's stupid. And if you take the poorest state in America, like Mississippi or Alabama or something, and compare it to Europe, it's like top five richest European countries. He would be at least. You take Mississippi, it's richer than France, it's richer than the UK, it's richer than maybe even Germany, I'm not sure. And well, it just goes to show that the US and North America in general is kind of skyrocketing in a way that Europe isn't really following up. Uh, America, on the other hand, North America, especially the US, on the other hand, is probably the strongest economically wise. Like America just objectively has a very good economy nowadays, and salaries in the US is like they're not even just a little bigger than elsewhere. They're like 3 to 5 times bigger. And even if you adjust it for cost of living, the disposable income Americans have after cost of living is stupidly high. The US dollar proportionally is stupidly strong, and overall, like in GDP growth, it's just been averaging out very, very decently ever since, I don't know, ever since 2016, honestly. And throughout the pandemic, the US has just been doing pretty well. Australia and New Zealand have been doing pretty well, but it's kind of a fake doing well because the thing with Australia is like, if you get 1 million people coming in every year and working, obviously it's gonna seem like it's great, but is it really? Because what they call here is a per capita crisis, a per capita uh, stagnation. Because people come here, they work, and obviously there's more people coming in. So in terms of GDP, it doesn't look that bad, but per capita, it's kind of stagnating or even falling. And so Australia and New Zealand do have that kind of problem. Not as grave as Europe, especially if you consider debt. Australia has like 30 or 40% debt to GDP ratio, which is fantastic. New Zealand isn't too different. The US and Europe are much, much worse in that sense. And last but not least, Latin America, it would probably be the second most problematic after Europe, and for obvious reasons. Latin America just seems to flirt with communism every 15 to 20 years, and inevitably you could get like a little bit of economic growth, but fundamentally left-wing authoritarians just come back to Latin America to hunt them, really, and there's no other explanation for it. You could look at Brazil, you could look at Argentina. It's just a cycle of getting slightly better and then much worse, and then slightly better and then much worse. And that is probably the single biggest problem in Latin America right now. It's just this terrible, terrible governance where the amount of bureaucracy in Latin America is incomprehensible. Like it's literally that's the only word for it. It's incomprehensible. And that's why out of all the four Western blocks, Latin America is literally the only one that's still poor, that's still undeveloped. There's exceptions. Uruguay has been doing pretty well. Argentina, despite having sucked for the last century, somehow is still better off than most countries in Latin America. Chile has been doing pretty well over the last 30 years or so. And so there's some consistency and there's some look of reform, right? In El Salvador, in Argentina. But it's kind of hard to see where it's going. Let's call it that. It's really hard to see where Latin America is going. And then one thing I forgot to mention before, that's one thing we should analyze as well, and I've already mentioned it just briefly just now, is debt. And in terms of debt, I'm, yeah, a close call between North America and Europe for the most problematic. Australia and New Zealand are by far the healthiest, and Latin America kind of gets protected by its own bad reputation, where it can't get too indebted because people don't trust it. Whereas America and Europe, well, they're the US, they're Germany, and so they get to get away with lots of things they really, really shouldn't get away with in terms of borrowing stupid amounts of money. That's definitely in consideration. And to wrap this video up, I believe in the West. I believe in the values. I believe in the countries. I've lived in every single one of these blocks. I've lived in Latin America, North America, and Europe, and in Australia, where I live right now. And I'm hopeful about it. I think we haven't been getting better, but I think we reached peak bottom in terms of policy around the pandemic in 2020. I think after that, we've really been trying to rebuild, and we've like people have woken up to the fact that I know fertility is a really, really, really big problem, and that immigration, there has to be some sort of middle ground. Uh, and midway with immigration because it's absolutely great, but it's also got lots of problems. And I don't know, I'm not 100% sure, but I'd say there there's hope for the West. This is the longest video in the channel so far, so if you got to here, it's amazing. Thank you, and hope you liked it. Uh, See you around.